I own 17 acres of cherry trees out in western Montana. Been working that land since the early 90s. And let me tell you something people from the city never really understand. Orchards are slow money. You don't plant trees for next year. You plant them for decades later. You build your whole life around patience, weather, and routines so repetitive they almost become religion. Every spring I'd walk those rows before sunrise with coffee in one hand and mud on my boots, checking buds, checking bark, talking to trees like some half-crazy mountain man, because after 30 years, those trees stop feeling like property and start feeling like family. And honestly, I thought I'd spend the rest of my life doing exactly that, quietly, peacefully, without anybody bothering me. Then Ridgeline Retreat bought the property uphill from mine, and everything went to hell. Now the land above my orchard had been empty for years, just pine trees and brush, and an old hunting cabin that looked one hard winter away from collapsing into firewood. But one summer, survey crews showed up, then excavators, then luxury SUVs with tinted windows and men wearing loafers in the dirt like they were auditioning for a real estate commercial. That's when I met Garrett Sloan. Developer smile, expensive watch, teeth so white they practically glowed in the shade. Guy shook my hand like he was doing me a favor. He said Ridgeline was building an upscale wellness destination. Spa villas, glass cabins, yoga decks, farm-to-table dining. All that rich people stuff where they pay $600 a night to pretend they discovered nature. And look, I didn't care. It was his land. Build whatever you want. America works that way. But then he said something weird. He looked down past my orchard toward the valley and smiled real slow. The views up here are unbelievable, he said. Once we clear the visual obstruction. Visual obstruction. That's what he called my trees. 30 years of work, a visual obstruction. At first I brushed it off because guys like Garrett always talk like that, like everything in the world exists inside a spreadsheet. But about 2 months later, my orchard started changing. Not dramatically at first, which honestly made it worse because it crept in slowly enough to mess with your head. Leaves curling brown in July, branches drying out on healthy trees, patches of bark turning brittle. I thought maybe fungus, maybe root stress from the heat. Called in an arborist named Ben who'd been working orchards longer than I had. Old guy with nicotine fingers and one eye that never fully opened. He walked the rows silently for almost an hour, kneeling in the dirt, scratching at roots with a pocket knife, smelling the soil like a bloodhound. Didn't say much while he was there, which scared me more than if he had. 2 weeks later, he called me around 6 in the morning. I remember because I was halfway through feeding my dogs when the phone rang, and the second I heard his voice I knew something was wrong. He goes, "You sitting down?" And man, nobody says that before good news. Ben told me the soil tested positive for industrial herbicide. Concentrated stuff, the kind used for aggressive land clearing, not backyard weed control. According to him, there was enough chemical saturation to kill mature root systems deep underground. Then he said the part I'll never forget. The contamination pattern runs downhill from the northern edge. That northern edge happened to border Ridgeline Retreat. So I walked the property line myself. And suddenly, all the little details started clicking together in the ugliest possible way. Their side of the hill had been scraped clean. No brush, no saplings, no undergrowth, nothing. Just raw dirt. And near the fence line, I noticed this faint pale residue across the weeds, like someone had sprayed in long sweeping passes without caring where the drift ended up. The farther downhill I walked, the more dead trees I counted. 10, 15, 23 by sunset. Trees older than some marriages, dead because some developer wanted spa guests to sip wine with a prettier sunset. I called Garrett immediately. Dude answered sounding annoyed, like I'd interrupted a golf game. I told him what Ben found. Long silence. Then he goes, "Well, our landscaping contractor did clear some vegetation up there. Maybe there was minor overspray." Minor overspray. 23 mature cherry trees dying from the roots up, and this guy says it like he accidentally spilled soda on my driveway. I said, "You poisoned my orchard." And this man, I swear to God, actually sighed into the phone. Let's not make this emotional. That sentence right there told me everything. Because when somebody destroys your livelihood and immediately starts managing your emotions instead of the damage, oh, they already know they're guilty. I hung up before I said something that would have landed me on the evening news. Then I went back outside and just stood there looking at those trees while the sun dropped behind the ridge. You gotta understand, orchard people notice tiny changes. We noticed one branch dying 50 yards away. So seeing entire rows starting to fade, it felt personal. Like somebody had walked into my house and started tearing pages out of family albums. And the craziest part? Garrett really thought I was gonna roll over. Probably figured I was just some rural guy with dirt under his nails who'd complain for a week, then disappear. What he didn't realize was this: farmers document everything. Every harvest, every pesticide, every weather swing, every irrigation cycle. You spend decades surviving bad seasons. You learn fast that records are the difference between survival and bankruptcy. So that night, I grabbed my camera, my property maps, soil bags, and a flashlight, and I started building a case. Now, before I get into how this whole thing exploded into an environmental disaster investigation, let me explain something, because a lot of people watching probably think this was just some rich developer being careless. Nah, this kind of thing usually runs deeper than that. According to standard procedure, commercial land clearing near agricultural property is supposed to involve buffer zones, wind monitoring, chemical logs, notification records, especially when you're spraying industrial herbicides on a slope above somebody else's land. That's not optional paperwork. That's basic liability prevention. And trust me, developers know this. Their lawyers know this. Their contractors definitely know this. So when Garrett tried acting casual about overspray, I already knew that excuse smelled like garbage. From a legal perspective, once chemicals cross property lines and damage income-producing land, you're no longer talking about a neighbor dispute. Now you're stepping into agricultural destruction, environmental contamination, negligence, maybe even reckless endangerment, depending on the water source situation. And here's the part people underestimate. Mature orchards are insanely valuable because you can't just replace 30-year-old production trees overnight. You lose years of yield, years of labor, years of biological maturity. Courts take that seriously. But psychologically, this is where it gets interesting. This is a psychological trap developers fall into all the time, especially guys who build luxury projects in rural communities. They start believing money automatically outranks history. They see locals as obstacles instead of people. Garrett looked at my orchard and didn't see a family business. He saw blocked scenery. And once somebody reduces your life's work into an inconvenience, they'll justify almost anything to remove it. The lesson here is simple. When somebody with power tells you it's not a big deal, while your gut is screaming otherwise, start documenting immediately, because the people who panic the least are usually the people who already planned their excuse. The next morning I called my attorney, Rachel Mercer. Now Rachel didn't look like one of those TV lawyers who slam folders on courtroom tables and yell objection every 30 seconds. She looked more like somebody's exhausted aunt who drank black coffee for breakfast and silently judged everybody around her. But that woman was dangerous in the best possible way. She listened to me for maybe 15 minutes, flipped through Ben's soil report once, then leaned back in her chair and said, "Yeah, this isn't accidental." No dramatic pause. No fake sympathy. Just cold certainty. I showed her the photos from the orchard, the dead root systems, the contamination line running downhill from Ridgeline's property. She asked one question that immediately made my stomach turn. Is there water access between the properties? And that's when it hit me. There was a creek. Narrow little stream cutting between the ridge and my orchard, mostly snow runoff and rain drainage. Nothing spectacular. I'd crossed it 1,000 times without thinking. But Rachel's expression changed the second I mentioned it. She reached for county permit records right there in front of me, scrolling through pages with the speed of somebody who'd ruined careers before lunch. Then she smiled. Not a happy smile either. The kind lawyers make when they smell blood in the water. "Garrett's screwed," she said. Turns out Ridgeline Retreat had environmental restrictions tied directly to that creek because it fed into a protected watershed about 6 miles downstream. Their permits required chemical buffer zones, runoff protections, erosion controls, the whole deal. Which meant if herbicide drift crossed into that waterway, this wasn't just property damage anymore. This was environmental contamination. And once the government smells water contamination, oh buddy, everybody starts panicking. Rachel contacted the state agricultural office first. According to standard procedure, they dispatched an investigator within 72 hours because commercial crop destruction gets treated seriously in Montana. Guy named Dale showed up wearing muddy boots and carrying a metal case full of sampling tubes like he was investigating a homicide scene. Honestly, he kinda was. We walked the orchard together while I explained everything. Dale barely spoke, just kept taking notes and scraping soil into little containers. Then we crossed uphill toward Ridgeline's construction zone, and suddenly the entire mood changed. The second he saw the clearing pattern near the fence line, his face tightened. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. There were spray marks everywhere once you knew how to spot them. Dead vegetation, burned patterns, bare earth extending almost all the way to the creek bank. And the closer we got to the water, the stronger that chemical smell became. Sharp, bitter, artificial. Even the grass looked sick. Dale crouched beside the creek for a long moment, dipped a testing strip into the water, then slowly stood back up. "You need to call environmental health," he said. "Not maybe. Not we'll see." He said it like a man who already knew somebody's life was about to collapse. Now here's where Garrett made the worst mistake of his entire career. He assumed money bought time. So while investigations were starting, Ridgeline kept building. Excavators still running. Crews still framing luxury cabins. Their social media accounts still posting cheesy marketing videos about living in harmony with nature, which, I swear to God, almost made me laugh myself unconscious considering they just poisoned half a hillside. 3 days later, county environmental officials arrived. Then state environmental officials. Then suddenly vehicles with federal markings started showing up too. That's when the panic finally hit Ridgeline. You could physically feel the atmosphere changing up there. Construction crews whispering. Contractors avoiding eye contact. Expensive trucks pulling in and out nonstop. One afternoon, I watched Garrett arguing with 2 men in suits near the entrance gate, waving papers around while sweat soaked through the back of his blue dress shirt. Gone was the calm luxury developer confidence. Dude looked like a gambler realizing the casino cameras actually worked. A week later, the water test results came back. Positive for herbicide contamination downstream. And not trace amounts either. Enough concentration to trigger immediate federal review. That's the moment Ridgeline Retreat died. They just didn't know it yet. See, from a legal perspective, environmental agencies don't care about your branding, your investors, or your inspirational website copy. Once contamination enters protected water systems, the machine starts moving, and it does not stop because rich people get nervous. Federal investigators started requesting chemical purchase logs, contractor records, permit compliance reports, spraying schedules, paperwork Garrett's team suddenly struggled to produce consistently. Then came the shutdown order. I remember standing near my orchard fence watching county officials physically post notices at the construction entrance while workers gathered around staring silently. All development activity suspended pending environmental remediation review. Big bold lettering. Might as well have said game over. Garrett finally came down to my property in person that evening. And man, he looked rough. No polished smile. No designer sunglasses. No confidence. Just anger held together with caffeine and desperation. He walked right up to me while I was checking irrigation lines and said, "You've made your point." That sentence almost made me laugh. My point. 23 dead trees, poisoned soil, contaminated water, and this guy still thought the issue was public relations. I told him, "No, Garrett. The state made the point. I just answered questions honestly." He stared at me for a second like he genuinely couldn't comprehend why I wasn't backing down. That's the thing about people used to controlling outcomes. Accountability feels like persecution to them. Then he tried switching tactics. "This can still go away," he said quietly. "We compensate you. Replace the trees, settle privately." Replace the trees. You ever hear somebody say something so stupid it almost resets your nervous system? You can't replace 30-year-old production trees. That's not how biology works. That's like burning somebody's house down and offering them a tent. I told him no. Flat out. And I watched the exact second he realized the situation had escaped his control. After that, everything unraveled fast. The EPA investigation expanded once sediment testing showed contamination beyond Ridgeline property boundaries. Cleanup estimates started climbing into the millions because they couldn't just spray some grass seed and call it fixed. They had to remove contaminated soil, stabilize runoff zones, rebuild creek banks, install monitoring systems, and fund long-term environmental oversight. Every delay burned money. Every inspection created new violations. Investors started disappearing almost immediately. And investors are funny people. They love visionary development opportunities, right up until federal agencies start collecting evidence. Then suddenly nobody returns calls anymore. Within 2 months, construction completely stopped. Half-finished luxury cabins sat abandoned on the ridge like skeletons. Tyvek wrapping flapping in the wind. Exposed framing getting hammered by rainstorms. Portable toilets tipped sideways in the mud. It looked less like a resort and more like the set of an apocalypse movie about failed capitalism. Ridgeline tried blaming the landscaping subcontractor publicly, which lasted about 48 hours before records showed Garrett himself approved the land clearing expansion near the property line. That little discovery hit hard during civil proceedings. Rachel absolutely dismantled them. Watching her work was honestly beautiful in a terrifying way. She'd sit there calm as church furniture while Ridgeline executives sweated through depositions trying to explain missing compliance records and contradictory spraying reports. At one point, she slid an enlarged aerial photo across the table showing the exact herbicide drift path running downhill into my orchard. Nobody spoke for almost 10 seconds. Finally, one executive muttered, "This looks bad." Rachel replied, "No, dead trees look bad. This looks expensive." I nearly choked trying not to laugh. By winter, the county revoked Ridgeline's occupancy certification entirely, meaning even if construction somehow finished, legally they couldn't open to guests. State regulators suspended operational licensing pending remediation compliance, which basically translated to good luck surviving the next decade. They didn't survive the next 6 months. Funding collapsed. Lawsuits piled up. Contractors sued for unpaid invoices. Environmental penalties stacked into the hundreds of thousands before cleanup costs even peaked. Last I heard, total damages and remediation crossed $8 million. All because one developer wanted a better view for rich tourists drinking wine beside an infinity pool. And here's the part that still gets me. If Garrett had simply respected the property line, literally just respected another human being's livelihood, none of this would have happened. The resort probably would have opened. People would have vacationed there. Everybody could have made money. But greed has this weird psychological effect where eventually people stop seeing consequences altogether. They convince themselves they're too important, too protected, too smart for rules to apply normally. Garrett thought he was managing an obstacle. He never realized he was creating evidence. By spring, Ridgeline Retreat officially declared bankruptcy. The property still sits empty today. Half-built cabins rotting into the hillside. Meanwhile, down below, my orchard's recovering slowly. We replanted where we could. Some sections survived better than expected. Takes years to rebuild something like that, but trees are stubborn. Honestly, farmers are too. And every now and then tourists still pull off the highway to take photos of the valley at sunset. Funny thing is, the view was always beautiful. You know, after this whole disaster, people kept asking me the same question over and over. Was it worth it? And honestly, I never really knew how to answer that cleanly. Because if by worth it, they mean the lawsuits, the stress, the months of waking up angry before sunrise, watching investigators crawl across your land while your business hangs in limbo. No, that part wasn't worth anything. I wouldn't wish that mess on anybody. But if they mean standing your ground when somebody powerful decides your life's work is disposable, yeah, that part mattered. See, a lot of people think these situations are about money. They're not. Not really. They're about disrespect. Garrett never looked at my orchard as something built through decades of labor. To him, it was scenery blocking a sales brochure. And once somebody starts viewing regular people as obstacles instead of human beings, bad decisions come easy after that. The lesson here is that entitlement escalates quietly. It usually starts with small language, visual obstruction, minor overspray. Let's not make this emotional. Those phrases are designed to shrink your reality while protecting theirs. This is a psychological trap people with power use constantly. They minimize the damage first, then they try making you feel irrational for reacting to it. And if that fails, they offer money fast before regulators start asking questions. That's why documentation matters so much. According to standard procedure, agencies, courts, insurance companies, they all move on evidence, not outrage. Doesn't matter how angry you are if you can't prove what happened. The reason Ridgeline collapsed wasn't because I yelled louder. It collapsed because every dead tree, every contaminated sample, every permit violation created a timeline nobody could explain away. From a legal perspective, this case also shows how quickly small violations become catastrophic when environmental regulations get ignored. A lot of developers gamble on shortcuts because shortcuts usually work until one doesn't. And when water contamination enters the conversation, consequences multiply fast. That's not bureaucracy being annoying. That's society deciding some damage costs too much to ignore. But honestly, the biggest thing I learned was simpler than all that. Patience beats arrogance more often than people think. Garrett wanted immediate results, immediate views, immediate profits. Meanwhile, orchards teach the exact opposite lesson. You plant carefully, you protect what grows, and you understand that some things worth having take years before they finally bear fruit. That mindset saved me. So now I want to ask you something. If you were in my position, would you have settled privately when Garrett offered money? Or would you have pushed forward knowing it might destroy the entire project? And more importantly, do you think he ever truly believed he'd face consequences? Or was he just too used to getting his way? Because personally, I think the resort was doomed the second they started believing the land belonged to them more than the people already living on it.